So this video gives an understanding of race and ethnicity, racism, oppression, and privilege, and it is just an introduction. I gave this talk at UMA and we had some tech problems, so I decided to record a video that goes along with the PowerPoint that nobody got to see at that presentation. So this is part of our Safe Zone program, and the Safe Zone program really is created to educate the campus community about gender and sexuality. So we know that there is a need for other kinds of education around other vectors of inequality. So here we're focusing on a foundational understanding of race and ethnicity, which we could think of as identity, as well as racism, oppression, and privilege, which we can think of as systems. I'm really aiming here for basic concepts, language, and movement toward ally work. If you have questions, please feel free to email me, and hopefully we'll be continuing these conversations even more on campus and beyond. So when we talk about race, a lot of times there's common defenses that come up. These defenses are mostly by, to quote Ta-Nehisi Coates, people who call themselves white, but not exclusively. So the kind of common defenses that I hear coming up is, but I never owned slaves, or I don't see color, I only see people, or racism only exists because black people won't stop talking about it, or race isn't the problem, class is the real issue. Racism no longer exists since we elected a black president. And probably the most popular lately is movements like Black Lives Matter are divisive, all lives matter. So you may have said these things or thought these things or heard these things, and while there may be some truths behind some of these are really problematic statements for a variety of reasons that I'm hoping that we'll get to more today. One of those might be what we see pictured here. Sometimes being an interracial person who only looks white is really embarrassing and lonely. So thinking a little bit about what kinds of racial and ethnic backgrounds or experiences people might have that might not be visible on the outside. This talk is not about white guilt. It's about education and knowledge. It's about truth, our colloquium theme for the academic year. It's about responsibility. And these are all important things because ignorance and misunderstanding often leads to anxiety and backlash. And really, when we're talking about race, there's no need for a position of defensiveness. And this is something that Sandy Whitehawk talked about at our convocation last week with her elevator metaphor, that we tend to really, be polite as people are getting on and off elevators, but when someone says something to her, for her example of calling her husband chief, and she tells them that's inappropriate and offensive, and they say, but I didn't mean anything by it, that's exactly the point of why we're here talking about these issues, is because even if we don't mean to offend, that ignorance is something that does need to be apologized for and does need to be something that we then change by having more education and being more aware of the variety of issues in this very complicated subject matter. This is also not only about white people. I live and work and teach in Maine, which is predominantly white, but not only. And this isn't just about white and not white, because there's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding around issues of race and ethnicity in the US. And we don't know a lot about these things because we don't learn these things in our education or in our lives unless we have to. So while racial and ethnic minorities, which I put in quote marks because I'm not a big fan of that term for a variety of reasons, they share a common history and contemporary reality of oppression, but there's still problems with, for instance, tensions both historic and contemporary between oppressed and racial ethnic groups, lack of knowledge about definitions and categories, and lack of knowledge about other peoples and cultures, which we can point to American education and American socialization on both of those points for why those things are lacking. And there's clashes between individuals who might identify with different racial or ethnic backgrounds. And there's hierarchies within ethnic and racial groups. So for instance, within the Black community, we see a racial hierarchy that's based upon the lightness of one's skin, with people who have lighter skin and more Anglo characteristics being higher on that hierarchy, and people with darker skin being lower on that hierarchy. So these are all results of this thing that we call race, which was created specifically to create a group that has more power over other groups by this completely arbitrary thing for the most part. So, to start with just two of the basic concepts and terms from the title of my talk, would be oppression and privilege. And in some ways, these are two different ends of the spectrum. So if you're in a group that is oppressed, you're at the bottom of the hierarchy. This is an unearned position. So in other words, you didn't do anything to get on that bottom of the hierarchy besides be born. Being on that bottom of the hierarchy means a lack of power, a lack of access to resources and other important things, and you might be oppressed as an individual, but also groups are oppressed. And it's important to note that oppression can be a pretty kind of abstract and general term, but it's really important to remember that when we're talking about oppression, we're talking about things like violence and incarceration and poverty being more apparent in terms of those oppressed groups. Bell Hooks notes that being oppressed means the absence of choices, and that's something that we can think a little bit more about as well. On the other hand, privilege is also something that's unearned. Pecky McIntosh describes privilege as an invisible, weightless backpack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks, and that could be literal or figurative. So if you have privilege, you're at the top of the hierarchy, you have power, you have access, and you're privileged as an individual, but this can also be based upon group status. Again, privilege is also unearned, and a little bit later I'll talk specifically about white privilege, which is privilege that white people have simply by the appearance of being white. So race and ethnicity, and what we're really getting at, this thing called racism, is complicated stuff with a long history. It's contradictory stuff with a lot of baggage. It's misunderstood stuff. It's a very emotional subject most of the time. Race has been a basis for division, but it's also been a means for connection. There's different socialization experiences based upon what racial or ethnic group we might identify with or we might be placed into. Race and ethnicity are part of intersectional identities. And this is stuff that we're not taught, but we learn. And again, we learn differently depending upon what place in society we occupy. Beverly Tatum talks about racism as smog in the air. So it's this stuff that's in the air all around us. We can't get away from it. We're all walking around in it. We're all breathing it. We're all taking it in. But we might have different effects from that smog. So when we talk about race, we're talking about a social construct. So what does this mean? So for instance, this means that there is no biological basis despite efforts to prove such. And this is, to this day, there are scientists with a particular agenda who are trying to prove that race is this very real thing and not just a social construct that was created for certain purposes. Why is it a racial construct or social construct? Is because definitions vary according to time and place. So different places in the world have different systems of racial categories. Brazil and Australia, for instance, have very different kinds of categories than we have and hierarchies than we have. And here in the US, the Irish were once considered to be black, but they were able to melt into that ethnic melting pot that is America, which we'll come back to. And interestingly, Irish were considered once to be black, and they were also once the dominating force in professional basketball. Go figure. Race is also a basis for measuring social inequalities by group. These definitions are often used to determine the distribution and application of power and resources. Race is also used as a basis for exploitation, all kinds of different exploitation. And one fact that I think, again, most Americans don't know is that while slavery may have existed everywhere in the world at all different times in our history, the U.S. system of slavery is the only race-based system of slavery ever in the history of the world. So again, it's this thing that we created, and then slavery and all of the different implications around that have continued to exist because of this. And race really actually has ethnic meaning in terms of identity and community, and oftentimes race is conflated as ethnicity. I'm going to come back to comment on some of these pictures that you'll see throughout the PowerPoint. This one I find to be pretty darn frightening and full of just misunderstandings and downright lies and etc. So Toni Morrison says race is, quote, both an empty category and one of the most destructive and powerful forms of social categorization. So let's look a little bit more closely at this idea of race, and you'll notice this is race/ethnicity. So I'll talk more about that relationship between race and ethnicity, but these are generally the 2010 census and the distribution, sorry about that, the distribution of different populations in the US. So if we take a look at the categories here and on the chart or the handout, if you have the handout in the next slide that it'll show you, we can see that there are these general kind of what I call umbrella terms. So these are terms that vary depending upon group definitions and leaders of groups and their definitions, as well as individual preference. A lot of times the terms that are chosen are political definitions, and they certainly can't capture the complexity of race or ethnicity within the US. So I call these racial and ethnic umbrellas. It's not just my thing that I came up with. And basically, these umbrellas help to simplify complex relationships. They categorize people generally according to established categories. They cover many different nationalities and ethnic traditions under that one umbrella. So, for instance, under the category of Asian, you might be Chinese American or Korean American or Japanese American, but you also might be from India. These categories also coincide with terms that are used by the government and the census and to categorize people and allocate resources, and they can also be used to organize people towards struggles for social justice. Also, an important thing to note, and I've heard a lot of the use of the word colored in Maine, which has pretty long been a term that's seen as being unacceptable, putting people first, people of color versus colored people. A little shift of language, but an important shift of language. And I see this kind of resurgence of the term here in Maine that's used pretty innocently by people who see themselves as being people of color or colored people or by family members. So again, generally the more kind of politically correct, for lack of another term, would be people of color. And again, it's always going to depend upon what the individual prefers. So again, looking at that chart, if you don't know how to identify someone, it is totally okay to ask them how they identify themselves racially or ethnically, and perhaps that's the start of a conversation where you might learn more about that person, about their race and ethnicity, or beyond that. So the handout that I have got these different racial and ethnic categories. And again, some of these terms are more census terms and some of them are more kind of political terms. So for instance, if we look at the racial and ethnic category of African American or of Black, a lot of times people think that African American is the more kind of proper term because it sounds better and Black sounds offensive. But actually, some people might prefer Black, and some people might choose Black because just because you're Black does not necessarily mean that you are from Africa or that you have direct kind of racial ancestry from Africa. Though one of the reasons why we have Black people in all different places in the world is because of the movement of slaves and people from Africa to other parts of the world. But that's a much longer history than we can look at today. So you might notice that there's no hyphen here in African American. So for the most part, hyphens have gone out of fashion, and you might ask someone who's really up on their grammar why that might be. And I note here in parentheses a couple of other terms that have been used in the past, like Afro-American or Negro, which used to be one of the terms that was used on the US Census. Like I mentioned before, Asian American, big umbrella that can hold a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds. The category of Indigenous or Native American or American Indian, there might also be different terms that are used there as well, depending on place or peoples, like First Nations, like our First Nations student group at UMA. And here again, we've got political categories. So Native American was a term that was created in the 60s and early 70s in order to unite a bunch of people who were united by a history of oppression, but otherwise did not necessarily come together as a group to fight against that oppression. So again, depends upon geographical location and other factors as well. The group Hispanic, I think, is a really interesting one because Hispanic is actually a term that was created by the government for the US Census, and in a couple slides I'll show kind of an evolution of that term. And so a lot of different terms are also used in place of that. So again, if you don't like the idea of the government giving you a term to call yourself and your peoples, you might go with the also umbrella term of Latino, or adding the /A to recognize the kind of sexism of the O ending of Latino. Or more commonly, that's starting to be used today, I'm not sure how to pronounce it actually, but that Latino, but with an X at the end, to keep the gender out of the equation. But then also Mexican American, which can be very specific to a particular nationality, and also Chicano, which can be a very political term. So Chicano means Mexican and American. In other words, I'm not going to choose one or the other. I am both, and therefore I am Chicano or Chicana. And again, much more complicated, just an overview and an introduction. White and Caucasian. So I find this category to be interesting because generally I think I've heard a lot of white people say, I prefer to be called Caucasian over white. Why? Well, because white sounds kind of lame and dumb, and it's a color of paper and whatever. It's not a color of people's skin, not that any of these others are. But in terms of what white means and what Caucasian means, again, both are terms that were created in order to try to prove the racial superiority of people who think themselves to be white, and Caucasian even more so problematic. And if you're interested in the issue, this is a really great blog or article here by Yolanda Moses. Why do we keep using the word quote unquote Caucasian? She's also got some other great posts that you can check out here. But there are Caucasian mountains in Europe, and there are people who come from those mountains, and those people are Caucasian, but white people in the United States using the term Caucasian probably are doing so because they don't realize that this term is actually a completely invented word in order to try to really give that idea of white more ethnic legitimacy. A very interesting topic that you can check out some more via Moses or other places. And finally, the census has started to make room for people of mixed race or interracial people by giving the category of 2 or more races, which is a growing category that basically doubled from one census to the next. So, moving forward from those terms, let's look at a couple of examples of how race and ethnicity have been used in problematic kinds of ways. So, this example here from Time Magazine, 1941, How to Tell the Japs from the Chinese. And so I find this to be just very interesting because, of course, in 1941, we were trying to identify who is our friend and who is our enemy. So there we've got, a rather derogatory Japs there from the Chinese. So already we can tell who's supposed to be our friend. And ridiculous kinds of things like some Chinese are tall, virtually all Japanese are short, or Chinese are not as hairy, or Japanese are hesitant, nervous in conversation, laugh loudly at the wrong time. The Chinese expression is placid, kindly, open, whereas the Japanese is more positive, dogmatic, and arrogant. And the Japanese walk stiffly erect while the Chinese are more relaxed. So again, an interesting example of using race and again in order to identify who our friends and our enemies are and the way that we skew those racial characteristics in order to show who's friendly and who's not. Another example is those evolving census terms. So in 1930, census categories were white, Negro, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, and Mexican was listed as a separate race. From 1940 to 1970, Mexicans were classified as white. 1940, persons of Mexican birth or ancestry who are not definitely Indian or of some other non-white race were categorized as white. 1950 and 1960, white persons of a Spanish surname, so it shifted from here to name. In 1970, it shifted to Spanish origin population, so it's shifted to origin. And then what's typically used 1980 into the present is Hispanic, but we also have Latino on that list as well. So again, different ways of using these terms in ways that might be problematic. So like I mentioned before, race is often conflated with ethnicity, and really when we're talking about race in the US, we're really talking about ethnicity. And so again, race is a social construct. It's something that's really just only skin deep, skin color, hair texture, facial features, etc. So ethnicity, again, sometimes related to race and used synonymously, but ethnicity speaks more to family heritage, geographical origins, shared language, shared customs and traditions, and a shared history of oppression, and perhaps more importantly, a shared history of resistance. So here I've got a picture of Rachel Dolezal, and if you're not familiar with the controversy surrounding her, definitely look it up. But in short, she was the president of a chapter of the NAACP in Spokane, Washington, and it came about that she was not actually African American as she was presenting herself to be, or not Black as she was presenting herself to be, and somewhat ironic considering that the NAACP was actually founded by white people and black people. But really, the problem is misrepresenting herself as a race that she's not. And here we see this quote, "I definitely am not white." So, does she have the right to choose what her ethnicity is? Very controversial subject. And for the most part, no. And in part, again, that's that shared history of oppression and shared history of resistance. She did not grow up as being a black person and did not have that same kind of history and resistance and oppression and traditions and customs and language and family heritage and etc. So there's a lot of material realities around the concept of race. So just because race is not quote unquote real does not mean that it does not have very real effects and impacts on people's lives. In fact, historical roots run deep. Fix my typo. Okay, so how has race shaped the US? And this is, of course, a very short list. So we have things like the one drop rule, which was the rule that if you have any black ancestry whatsoever, you are black. And this has had a lot of different impacts and effects, both positive and negative. Segregation, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, and of course, we cannot forget slavery and genocide. Again, things that were based upon race. If we look at mass incarceration today, looking back at that distribution of race and ethnicity in the US, if about 70% of the US is white, about 70% of the prison population is black. So we've got almost a direct flipped ratio in terms of representation racially in prison and outside of prison. Redlining is a practice that still happens today, and that's things like banks and corporations or whatever, looking at a map and drawing a red line around an area and saying anybody living in this area, for instance, will not be eligible for a home loan. We see the post-World War II GI Bill, and again, I think a fact that a lot of Americans probably don't know or realize that through World War II, we still had segregated troops. So we had black troops in one group and white in the other. And post World War II, returning soldiers were supposed to have access to education and housing, and a variety of different things like redlining made it so that black veterans were not getting the same kinds of benefits when they came back to the US, where things were still not equal, despite the fact that they had been fighting fascism and Hitler and all of these things when they were still not equal at home. Immigration and Naturalization Acts of all kinds. The first one in 1790 literally states that you have to be white in order to immigrate to the US. Racial profiling, which again continues to have impacts today. The melting pot, as I mentioned before, this is this kind of myth and idea of this kind of ideal US, and the fact is, of course, that white people of different ethnicities could melt into this melting pot, but if you were not white, you were not allowed to melt into the pot. And so that caused a variety of different issues around white privilege and oppression and etc. And things we might not think of very often, but for instance, definitions of beauty, representations of women in fashion magazines and other places are overwhelmingly white, and oftentimes women who are featured who are not white are very light skinned and fit a lot of those Anglo kinds of ideals of beauty. So again, a lot of impacts, and that would be the short one. So all of these things that I just mentioned are because white people basically decided that they were superior, and then they have worked to keep themselves in power throughout the history of the United States. So there's a problem with this history, and that makes a problem with this quote-unquote white identity. So what are some problems with white identity? First of all, it's a category that was created in order to establish a position of privilege. It's a shared history that's based upon oppression of others, other people, and other groups. Is often defined only as a lack of something. So for instance, a lack of privileges. So Tim Wise talks about different anti-racist kinds of workshops that he does. And when he has people in these workshops and he's asking them, what do you like about your race, or what do you what do you value about your race? Black people will say things like, oh, I'm really proud that my family survived and that I can be here today. Or, I really like this certain tradition that we had. Or I really appreciate that I can speak the language that my ancestors spoke, or whatever those reasons might be for a racial pride. And then white people tend to give answers like, well, it's really great that when I go to the store, I don't get followed around, or like when I get pulled over by the cops, I know that I'm more likely to like not get a ticket, and those kinds of things. As I mentioned before, Caucasian is a completely invented term that attempts to give this category of white some kind of legitimacy. And more so, white supremacy is written into our laws and institutions and is a legacy of US history. And perhaps the most problematic is that white nationalists and white supremacists use this identity as a basis for hate. So I mentioned before that I would come back to this, and I haven't gotten to this particular picture yet, but this one here, looking at the kind of reaction to this idea of anti-racism and to racism itself, and this kind of perceived threat that white people are undergoing a genocide right now, and it's all because of immigration and things like diversity and multiculturalism, which is extremely wrong and problematic, and that a lot of these factors are really not what's causing the disappearance of white people, so to speak. So again, a really complicated and problematic kind of aspect of whiteness. I'll come back to this when we get to the slide. So Peggy McIntosh talks about white privilege as the unquestioned and unearned set of advantages, entitlements, benefits, and choices bestowed on people solely because they are white. Generally, white people who experience such privilege do so without being conscious of it. And that's part of the point of privilege generally and of white privilege. But even when it is not so extreme, we get a lot of that, again, kind of reaction of, but I can't help that I'm white. And of course, no one can help that they're white any more than someone can help that they're black or Asian or Native American or whatever that might be. We are born as who we are born. So this is all true. Can't help that I'm white. But having white privilege means that we can use white privilege as a platform to speak out about inequality, violence, racism, oppression, the things that if we think there's a problem with them, then we have that responsibility to step up and do that. Here we see very reactionary and undercutting the very serious topic of racism, which I'm almost getting to. And so this idea that racist is just a word that white guilt liberals use to show they hate the color of their own skin, or a word when someone's not getting their way or they said something that they disagreed with, then you throw out that term racist, right? You throw out the racism card. And again, really problematic in terms of the kind of message of this here, but not uncommon. So if we see these things as a problem, and I'm going to get a little bit later into thinking about being an ally, so we want to do something, and one of the reasons why is this metaphor that Beverly Tatum has of the moving walkway. So the idea, so if racism is a moving walkway, then we might be actively racist by standing on that moving walkway but walking with it, so we're walking faster toward the goal of racism. Or maybe we're just standing, and if we're just standing still but we're on a moving walkway, that moving walkway moves us forward anyway. So in terms of fighting racism, of being anti-racist, you have to turn around and you have to actively walk back against that moving walkway. So I really like this metaphor because it really shows that that kind of passiveness is still a form of racism, and actively fighting against it is really the only way to be anti-racist. Howard Zinn has a similar kind of idea. You can't stay neutral on a moving train. And again, Sandy Whitehawk at our convocation gave us that idea of the elevator and thinking about how we relate to people and how we treat people. So ultimately, the problem is that racism is not ancient history. The wheels are in motion. We're either on that walkway, being moved along, or we're turning around and we're walking against it. This is only more obvious and more contested in the era of Trump. And of course, Black Lives Matter is a really big controversial thing. And in short, if we look at Black Lives Matter, if we look at that phrase, That's certainly not saying that all lives don't matter. It's simply saying that Black lives matter. It does not say anybody else's lives don't matter. And again, focused on saying Black Lives Matter because it's very apparent that our judicial system doesn't know that. And I would say even more than our judicial system doesn't know that. I think, American pop culture maybe doesn't know that. And we might look at other aspects of our society and culture that perhaps have not quite gotten that memo yet. So, racism, not ancient history. So, let's look a little bit more closely at racism. So, generally, when we talk about racism in the US, we're talking about really an individual act, someone saying something mean to someone else that's based upon racial stereotypes, for instance. Accusations of racism are fraught with tension. I see amongst my white colleagues, for instance, and I don't mean that just at UMA, but in all the places that I've been, that calling a white person racist is like the ultimate insult these days and a cause for major defensiveness. I'm not racist. I have black friends, or whatever the excuse might be, which is a very funny joke, actually. So it's really important to remember that racism, in terms of like someone making a statement that could be conceived of as racist, does not mean that that person is necessarily a racist, or does not necessarily mean that that person is bad. In fact, we all live in America, which is a racist society, with white supremacy built right into our laws and customs and institutions. And so we could, in a way, say we are all racist because we are all a part of this bigger system. But again, racist does not necessarily equal bad. It can, but more it means uninformed, ignorant, and reactive. So Sandy Whitehawk used this term microaggressions, which is becoming more and more popular, and is not just connected to race or racism. But the idea with microaggressions is again back to that kind of ignorance and that uninformed nature, where you say something and the way that it is perceived and taken by the person hurts them and is an insult to them, and perhaps you did not realize it. But again, ignorance is not necessarily an excuse for saying something that hurts someone else. The more aware we are of that, then perhaps that can open a conversation. So, looking at this chart here in terms of thinking about racism, the left-hand column, which I term classic racism, which I don't like this term, and please don't confuse that with other uses of the term classic, like classic cars or classic music. Classic is not necessarily a good thing here, but it is classic in terms of this is the way that general society thinks about racism, an individual against another individual. So this kind of racism can be conscious and deliberate, usually can occur on a continuum. Again, motives and intentions can be considered but not necessarily used as excuses. Racism is really not presently acceptable to white middle class American society, except that it is becoming more acceptable, or at least more visible, in the era of Trump. But generally, it would be considered to be rude to be racist, again, on that individual level. Might be more covert or might be more overt, and there's arguments over what kind of racism is the most harmful, the stuff that's out in the open and predictable, or the stuff that's hidden. Might be more active or passive, and again, this is where we can think of microaggressions. So typically we think about this category of racism as a moral and ethical issue, and in order to solve this problem, we might think about someone needing therapy, so dealing with those emotional issues that might make them say mean things to other people. Or we might think that that approach is intellectual. Through education, we can inform people, and once they understand and realize, they won't be racist anymore. Okay, possible. So that middle column is really, when I'm talking about racism in this talk, this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about institutional or structural racism. I like the term structural, but institutional is a little bit more descriptive. So you may have heard a statement like, well, black people can't be racist. And so in terms of this middle column here, institutional racism, that's what we're talking about when we say people of color can't be racist. Why? Because they do not hold the social, political, or economic power to harm other groups of people. But if we look all the way over to the right side of this chart, the non-white racism side, we have to look back left to that classic racism, because Everyone can be an asshole. It does not matter what racial category you belong to. If you're a jerk, you're a jerk. If you're closed-minded, you're closed-minded. So if we're only basing racism on that quote unquote classic definition, then anyone can be racist. But we could use other terms like they could be a bigot or they could be a jerk or whatever that might be. So, non-white racism could often be the result of not fitting in with dominant white society, or a kind of self-hatred that comes through in what we call internalized racism. So in other words, if you live in America and you're told over and over and over again that black is bad and white is good, you might start feeling like you're not too good if you're black and you're raised in that society, for instance. Non-white, like I said, non-white racism cannot be institutional. White people as a group and individuals control most institutions, most formal structures of power. Non-white people are not in a position to instigate, administer, or carry out services or power, even necessarily on the small scale. And non-white racism might also appear around issues like authenticity or loyalty, economic competition, again, colorism, that different hierarchy of lighter skin and darker skin, or patriotism, or whatever those other things might be involved. There might be positive or negative coping mechanisms like drugs or alcohol, violence, or positive coping mechanisms like activism. So, in general, again, looking at that kind of individual basis of racism, but more importantly, that institutional and structural racism. So, the obligation is on whites and non whites, on all people in the US and in the world, perhaps, to dismantle and restructure the institutions and systems that are racist in nature. So, institutional and structural racism, again, can be different organizations and traditions. And the individuals who carry out and perpetuate institutional racism may or may not be classically racist, but again, it's that moving walkway. Structural racism is something that's very well understood by probably most racial minorities in the US because they experience it on a day-to-day basis, but it's not often acknowledged or understood by, again, white middle-class American society. There's often backlash against different policies that are aimed at remedies of this situation. Institutional structural racism can also be overt and covert, and over time has become more covert. So, in the past, the kind of overt things of segregated public facilities and Jim Crow laws, like I mentioned before, but covert institutional racism might be found in requirements for participation, or attitudes or actions of socially undesirable people, or different social assets like legacies or inheritance. So the kinds of remedies of like affirmative action or reparations are often seen as quote unquote reverse racism by some whites and by some non-whites, to be fair. And there is no such thing as reverse racism. Again, even if we're over on the right and left hands of those categories, you can't reverse racism. So there is this thing that is institutional racism, and it has these very real effects, conditions, effects, and results of poverty, for instance. Different intersections in terms of class, gender, ability, sexuality might need to be considered. And we've got these American myths of meritocracy. So in other words, that idea that we're all judged on our character and our skills and our abilities and not upon the color of our skin, which is not true, and hence why it is a myth. So, when we're talking about racism, we are really talking about structural racism, and it can be perpetuated by stereotypes, prejudice, bigotry, ignorance, defensiveness, racism, ethnocentrism, nationalism, all of these different isms. But it's not simply just an individual problem. It is a societal and a cultural and a structural and an economic and an institutional and all of these different ways. And what further perpetuates this is this idea that we're taught that to be colorblind is ideal. So first of all, being colorblind is problematic for a variety of reasons, and one reason why is that if you say you don't see race, that's impossible, because race is only visible. There's no such thing as being colorblind in this way, because we do see it. So what people mean when they say this is probably more something like they don't judge based upon that. But again, even that is problematic. And in fact, different studies have shown that colorblind policies actually cause greater inequalities. So for instance, in an educational setting, if a teacher says that they are colorblind, oftentimes they are still carrying out those actions of inequality. They're just not conscious of doing so. Further, the kind of classic line from Martin Luther King Jr., that, someday I have this dream of being judged on the content of character, not on the color of skin. And these are words that are taken out of context and repurposed, and they're words that are used by the right and by the left and everybody in between, to give this idea that we should be colorblind and we should not be considering the color of skin, even though we really have to because our institutions make it so. So why is this important to understand? In part, it's important to understand race and ethnicity in order to understand individual and group identities, as well as different vectors of social inequality. And further, the more that we understand race, the more we can understand how these categories of race that might be socially constructed and might be problematic and might be divisive also help people to come together and to develop consciousness. So Naomi Zak, who's one of the references on the handout or the earlier slide, notes that at first only a small number of the oppressed group or members of another group who sympathize with their situation find the words and do the deeds to create self-awareness of the conditions of oppression. So, again, while race divides people, it brings people together. Race creates group identity, and groups can rename and reclaim terms of oppression. Groups can encourage and motivate actions based on self-awareness to change those conditions of oppression. And all of this thinking about race also generates new knowledge, new theories, and new practices. Ta-Nehisi Coates, in his book, which I did not include as a particular reference here, Between the World and Me, is a beautiful book, a heavy book, a short book, that's definitely well worth reading. My students in Introduction to American Studies are reading it in a few weeks. And one of the things he says in this book, besides problematizing this idea of whiteness, they made us into a race. We made ourselves into a people. And that's exactly getting at this quote from Naomi Zak here. But in terms of creating consciousness, raising consciousness, non-white does not always equal conscious or automatically equal conscious. So Morgan Freeman, very famous in this way of being very outspoken against racism and why it exists and how we can end racism. And I've had a lot of students who like to quote Morgan Freeman, and basically a lot of white people who like to say, well, if Morgan Freeman says this, it must be true, right? How do we stop racism? He says, stop talking about it. I'm going to stop calling you a white man, and I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man. Problem solved. No more racism. Of course, not so easy. So in terms of thinking about consciousness and identity and etc., things can skew our consciousness. Power and privilege, successful assimilation, class advantage, fame, even marginalization or isolation can skew perceptions of race and racism, privilege, and oppression. One person almost never speaks for the entire group. And in fact, that's one of the things that Peggy McIntosh notes in terms of white privilege, is that's one thing that white people are never, or very rarely, I'd say never, called upon to speak for their race. How many times does someone in the room say, hey, what do you think, white person? What do white people think about this? Okay, again, not to say it doesn't happen, but it does not happen to white people as much as it happens to non-white people. So, what are we getting at? We're talking about consciousness, raising consciousness, and consciousness means allies. As you develop consciousness through knowledge and experience, you also develop ways of seeing yourself as an ally and doing work that's important to end oppression, all kinds of oppression, including racism. And so it's really important to note one thing that Bell Hooks, who's a academic hero of mine, talks about in terms of consciousness, and that is, she says, theoretically, if white people are progressive, have truly engaged in radical consciousness or conscientization, we would have a setting where everything's run by white people, but the perspectives are not biased. While diversity is meaningful, The essence of divesting in all these things is that you should not need the presence of women or the presence of people of color of both genders in order to have progressive, non-biased action take place. And I think this is really important because we tend to think about diversity as being something that is only skin deep. So we like to see that there is diversity, and that somehow helps us to know that there's diversity. But as Bell Hooks is arguing here, it's not so much what people look like as it is what people think and know and what's in their hearts. So if you do that work to educate yourself, to be conscious and aware of your words and your actions, then you're doing that work that's working toward a better world and an end to oppression and racism and all of these isms. So, what do we do? Well, in the spring, we'll have our level 2 Safe Zone ally training where we talk more about what it means to be an ally. And again, we are all allies to different groups who might be struggling with different vectors of inequality and oppression in our culture. We can join the struggle where we can. We can embrace responsibility, develop an informed intersectional understanding, and help to educate others as well as ourselves. And this is important work, and it shouldn't be simply dismissed because, of course, these are very long, complicated, difficult issues, and the more we run away from them and fail to understand them, the more problems that we're going to see and the more problems will be caused. But if we start to really work toward that understanding and toward creating social change that's meaningful and deep, and taking the cues from the people who have been doing this work for decades and decades, that's a really important step. So once you're awake, it's hard to go back to sheep. And the ultimate tragedy, as Martin Luther King Jr. has said, is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people. So figuring out where you are on that moving train or that moving walkway and turning around and walking against it might be one way to start. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me and I will attempt to do my best to answer those questions. And again, we'll continue to have these conversations throughout the school year, throughout classes, and into the future in our educational settings, but hopefully outside of those as well.